Hello, everyone. If you're just joining now, you are in the Waterhackweek 2020 Cyberseminar series, the second presentation of the series. And just hang tight. We're going to get started in just a minute. Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the 2020 Waterhackweek seminar series. This is the second presentation. The seminar series is started January 3rd and it's running through March 12th, the same time every week, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. So thank you everyone who's joining. For those of you that are new or need a refresher, Waterhackweek is a one-week event where a variety of scientists and students get together to solve real-world problems using software tools and scientific approaches, various approaches for solving problems. It's a fantastic event held in Seattle in March 23rd through 27th. This seminar series is designed to prepare people for some of the things that they may encounter at this event. In previous year, or the first year of Waterhackweek was last year, and the seminar series focused on introducing new technologies and software and tools to the participants. This year we've shifted focus a little bit to focus on real-world problems and bringing together researchers to discuss some of the challenges around these problems and some of their solutions. So in this presentation, like other presentations, you will see a variety of software tools. These aren't things that you're meant to know how to use or be an expert in, but they're just tools to solve the problem. So if you see some different things today, you will see some different things today. You will have some links at the end of the presentation to learn more about some of the data repositories we're going to talk about today. All right, so that's it. So each of these seminars is structured very similarly. Each one has some provocative theme. Today we're going to be talking about metadata and specifically how metadata the importance of metadata in scientific research. We've organized three people to serve on a panel to introduce some of the work that they have done and also field questions. Now, if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box and we will answer them at the end. And then once the question and answer, the panel discussion is complete, we're going to talk a little bit about we'll introduce a professional development topic, some learning resources, and then any specific Waterhackweek announcements. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that we have a Waterhackweek Slack group. This Slack group is the perfect place to start a discussion with the organizers and even past participants in Waterhackweek and then future participants in Waterhackweek around some of the things you hear in these Cyberseminars or even project ideas and things like that. So channels you may be interested in are, well, the general discussion, event logistics, anything about cyber seminars, project brainstorming. It's never too early to start thinking about project ideas and such. To join this chat group or the Slack group, go to the link on the screen, waterhackweek.typeform.com/those TO and then that code, and that will take you to a form where you can enter your name and your email address, and then after the cyber seminar ends, we'll send you an invite to join the Slack group. This is a perfect place to ask questions about specifically you may have some questions about last seminar. This is the perfect place to start asking those questions, and hopefully you'll have some questions or some thoughts about this cyber seminar that you can also ask there. So, like I said, today we're talking about metadata, specifically publishing data and research findings. We have 3 panelists that are going to talk today. The first panelist is Emilio Mayorga. He's going to be talking about the observations data model and some work they've been doing trying to capture metadata for scientific measurements and analysis. Then we have Amber Jones, who's going to be talking about working in large groups, sharing data from observation data to publishing that with formal digital object identifiers. And then finally, Jezra Beaulieu, sorry, I probably pronounced it wrong, who's going to talk about reproducible science with a case study that she's been working on the Nooksack River watershed. So before we get started with those presentations, I want everybody on this call to think about the following questions. This will help frame our discussion. And the first is metadata a gift to the future? And then, is there a chance that metadata could also save our species from extinction? So keep these in your mind as the panelists present their work, and use them to frame your questions at the end. So I'd like to give a very brief introduction to metadata. Many of you are probably already familiar with metadata. You may already experience it with some of the research you do, but this may be a new concept to some of you. And metadata the definition would be a set of data that describes and gives information about other data. So metadata is data that describes data. And that's kind of strange to think about, but the truth is metadata is everywhere. So we're going to talk about it in the science perspective, but if you've ever taken photos and you look at the EXIF data, if you right-click on your photo and look at the details, you're going to see things like the type of camera that shot it, the aperture, the speed of the film, even geolocation. So sometimes when you take a photo and you can automatically upload it to a social media site, it knows exactly where that photo was taken. That's all important information that helps describe the image that you're looking at. So that's all metadata, where the actual data would be the image. And this is very similar for like your phone contacts. The person might be the data, but that person has home and work phone numbers and emails, and that person has a birthday and an address and things like that. And just a third example, this shot on the right, the screenshot on the right is from IMDb, the Internet Movie Database. The movie has all sorts of metadata, such as plot keywords, genre, the country, the release date, filming locations, all of that stuff. So just metadata is kind of a scary thing to think about when you're jumping into it with a specific focus on science, but it's really just, it's not that scary, it's everywhere. And it's actually super helpful. Now in the water sciences, it's a little bit more complicated, and mostly just because the data you're describing isn't something fun like a picture. Instead, it's a time series of data, for instance, on the left-hand side. So you have all of this data, you have timestamps, you have measurements. But then if you look at the top of the screen with all these hash marks, you see things like there's some code and it has a parameter and it has a description, such tides, gauge height in feet. That's all really, really important information to describe the values that you're seeing in these time series. Otherwise, you really have no context for what these measurements are. So something like a unit is a very basic but important piece of metadata. If you were to give someone a spreadsheet of just values, it really doesn't mean anything until you tell them what the heck those values are. And all that description of what those values are is metadata. Another place you're going to see it are in descriptive file types, things like GIS files. A shapefile is in GIS, a shapefile is a very common format. Shapefile is actually 7 files, I think, but maybe 7 plus or minus. And they store a variety of information, right? So you might have some sort of a polygon that represents the state boundary, right? But that polygon, we need to tell it what projection information, right? We need to tell it all about attributes inside of that and all that. And that's all metadata. It's not as fancy or fun, but it's incredibly important. If someone were just to give you some polygon, it doesn't mean anything unless you can put it, spatially align it with maybe a base map so you can see where that thing exists. And then just a final example, if you're familiar with multidimensional binary files, NetCDF is very common. This is a way of stacking a lot of data across grids or various indices. And here you need to know, instead of just having this giant matrix of data, you really need to know what all the different variables are and the different ways they're indexed. So it can go anywhere from very simple, I have a time series, it has some units, it's a variable, it was collected by someone, all the way to I have this very complicated data that's indexed in various ways. So it's simple to a little more difficult or complex. But the reason why this is okay is because all of this extra metadata allows us to build some really cool things. So not only does it help us remember, so you do your study, it helps you remember that, oh, I did collect this data, and oh yeah, I collected that in units of meters. That's helpful, of course. But also, if you describe your data sufficiently, software applications can be built around them to help expose your data and share it with the world. And I have 2 applications here that are going to be mentioned in the talk. The first one on the left-hand side is the quasi-hydrologic information system. And this is primarily focused at observation data. This is data at a single point in time, but various variables. And you can see some of that metadata in the bottom left corner of this table. And on the right-hand side, we have other types of data. For instance, you want to upload a shape file plus time series plus some model results. Well, you can do that in HydroShare, and you can manually add all kinds of other metadata like an author and an owner and citation, things like that, keywords. So it really helps us build, or it enables us to build really cool software tools that promote things like collaboration, but it's also really important if you're going to collaborate, even in a small team, that you all understand the common language you're using, whether that is the units that you're going to use or the variables that you're going to measure and things like that. So that is the primer on metadata. And hopefully that'll give you an idea of kind of the basis for where all these talks are starting. So our first presenter is Emilio, and I'm going to pass over control to him right now, and he's going to talk a little bit about his work with the observations data model. Go ahead, Emilio.
Hi, so I'm Emilio. Pleasure to be here. I'll start very briefly with a brief background, which I think helps explain where I've been or my approach to the work that I'm doing. As that title says, I'm an oceanographer, but that's kind of in theory. I got my graduate degree in oceanography, but I was actually studying, I got my PhD studying river biogeochemistry. So I looked at carbon and nutrients in rivers and how watersheds interacted with the rivers, with the perspective of hydrology also. But over time, I ended up sort of transitioning into focusing more on data systems to support aquatic science, environmental aquatic sciences, both freshwater and marine applications, and also all the way from supporting basic science to supporting public use of that data and understanding of that data. So that's where I'm coming from. And these days, I'm also sort of a software developer and data system manager. Okay, I just clicked page down, and it didn't. Oh, there it is. Okay. I hope it doesn't move again. to lay out the context that we all collect field measurements that are under very diverse and different sampling schemes or approaches or goals. So some examples are that sensors are for time series are becoming more and more common, are fantastic resources, and if you leave them deployed for a long time, you end up collecting continuous time series over a long period. So for example, I'm going to illustrate this with a scenario of a research study where you're collecting continuous time series from sensors at let's say at 3 stream sites in your reach, and you're collecting temperature and conductivity from sensor X, dissolved oxygen from sensor Y, and nitrate from sensor Z. So you've got data from 3 different sensors that have different characteristics. Let's say you did this over 3 years, because that's the length of your study. But during that time, you have to clean the sensors because they get dirty. So so you have to clean them and recalibrate them to adjust the data. And let's say that you do that every 6 months. But one sensor broke during that period too, and you had to replace it, and maybe you had to replace it with a different brand. So once you interpret the data, it's important for you to know that for half of that time series, you were using one type of sensor, and for the other half, a different one. But at the same time that you have the sensors deployed, you're also collecting suspended sediment physical samples at 2 of the sites, and you can only do it at daily because those things take a lot of resources and time. So you go out there and bring your water bottle. Can you see my cursor, by the way? I don't know if you can see my cursor.
We can't see a cursor.
Okay. You said you can't? Cannot?
Cannot.
Okay. Anyways, over to the right where it says measurement result, you can see a bottle. So you collect a volume of water into a bottle or something like that. And then you go to the lab. Maybe you keep it in cold in a cooler. You go to the lab, and then you filter it for sediment concentration analysis. But there are different filters that you use for different applications. So you may use one filtration with a 1 micron glass fiber filter to collect sediment concentrations, the total suspended sediment concentrations. And then you filter the other half of the water bottle through a different filter to analyze for carbon and nutrients. Because you're trying to understand how things change along this reach, you also measure temperature, dissolved oxygen, and pH, and other groundwater tracers along that transect, let's say for 100 meters at different points. And you do it once or 2 or twice or 3 times. So very different kinds of data collections with different kinds of sample processing and analysis approaches. Let's see, I clicked space now. There's a lag here. Sorry, I'm waiting to see if it changes. Okay, hopefully it'll stay there. I've been involved in that for the last several years, 8 years or so, in the development of a system and collection of tools called the Observations Data Model version 2, or ODM2, that a number of colleagues, and you can see below that some of the core leads, and many people that have contributed to this in one way or another, including the next speaker, Amber. Our goal is to try to bring more consistency into how we manage that diversity of data. And this ODM2 is an information model and the software to support that, the collection of software that handles that data storage or information model for observations at individual sites or along a transect and that sort of stuff. You can follow up later to our website or our code repository on GitHub. So we're trying to address that potentially really confusing and very diverse and heterogeneous and messy kind of data that ultimately has common characteristics, including time, the fact that you measure this at some point in time, location, where it comes from, what methods you use, what variables you measure, etc. And specifically, we wanted to improve the integration management of data that comes from sensors and sample-based data. Ultimately, those different types of data are collected to address the same kinds of questions, but they have common things, but very different characteristics as well. And doing that, integrating those data in a more common way will improve interoperability. In other words, the use of that data, regardless of the fact that they're so different, across scientific disciplines and cyber infrastructure or software tools. We didn't start this from scratch. We're building on prior efforts, especially from CUAHSI, but also other community efforts. Let's see. I clicked on page down. Okay. I'll just very briefly, don't worry about not understanding a lot of this, but in ODM2, the metadata is stored within the database, and it makes it easy. It takes more effort to put it in initially, but then you can generate it, just like Tony showed, more readily into and connect it to other systems. It can store the processing workflows, like what I just mentioned, the filtration steps. You collected water, let's say 100 milliliters of water at this location at this time, and you filtered it through this mechanism, and then it went into this instrument. We use what's called controlled vocabularies for metadata. In other words, we call temperature via a unique and consistent label, as opposed to temp or temperature underscore C. And we leverage or use what's often called persistent unique identifiers. You may have heard of DOIs, Hydrologic identifiers, for papers. If you're in the academic community, hopefully you've heard of ORCID. Basically, it's a unique identifier for you. And IGSN, the International Geological Sampling Number, it's a DOI for physical samples, so that you can unambiguously refer to as physical sample and all the data that derive from it. And data is handled consistently and can be exported into other systems or formats. We use open source tools and development processes on GitHub. You'll be hearing more about GitHub. And open source tools include Python, relational databases, and other services. And we have developed the steps and tools to integrate into CUAHSI systems. And one of those being HydroShare, time series, sensor time series in ODM2 are handled really nicely and automatically in HydroShare for physical samples. It's called measurements or sample-based data. The integration is partial, and yeah, I'll illustrate that later. But still better than if you just uploaded some Excel file, random Excel file. Okay, hitting page down and waiting. Okay, and that's a plug to HydroShare and Tony, because Tony works for CUAHSI, but also to illustrate that if you create a new HydroShare resource and upload an ODM2 database, it'll automatically extract a lot of this metadata. That's where you start getting the benefits of the investment you put into good metadata. Because it knows how the database is structured, it'll automatically pull in a lot of things, like the abstract keywords that you enter. In this case, those keywords are common. It's not just your made-up word. Well, it's a mix of your made-up words, but also for things like variables like chloride, it'll typically connect to, it'll know what chloride is. And it'll pull out the spatial information and give you that bounding box. This is from Christina, our fearless leader for the Waterhackweek in Puerto Rico, or project in Puerto Rico. But for sample-based data, it's still not perfect. You'll run into this kind of warning, because the work needs to be put into HydroShare, and that always takes effort, to make the interpretation of sample-based data more perfect. But this is still better, like I said, than if you were uploading a random Excel file where you just wouldn't know what to do with it. Okay, I click page down again. Oh, there it is. As an example of, again, how you can manage the data with ODM2 and what you, how you get to benefit from it. There is an application built, a web application, a user interface built on top of an ODM2 database. In other words, meant to support data on ODM2. It's called CZ Manager, Critical Zone Manager. It used to be called ODM2 Admin. You can go to the open source link, the link to the open source software here on the right. The example I'm using is from a project that I've been a part of. It's kind of watery, but it's a little drier than most water applications. It's on soils. Here we are collecting data on soil depth profiles. Within that depth profile, you have multiple depth intervals and that are samples and analysis are made at different depth intervals or sections. And within each chunk, let's say a 10 centimeter interval, people take different subsamples. You take, if you collected 10 grams or 100 grams, you take 10 grams and it goes through a processing analysis chain into a different instrument in a particular lab. Another 10 grams goes to another lab, processed in a different way, and you get different results that all need to come together to support the broader science. This is all a work in progress. There's a link here if you happen to be curious about this at the bottom left, although this is all a work in progress. And there is these screenshots are not publicly available yet, or that system. These links that you see on the left is that hierarchy of samples. You start at a site. That site has one profile, that's the purple icon, and that profile, in other words, that one depth profile has multiple specimens or sample feature types. Here, the specimen is the sections. So when you click on the profile, you get all this cycle of specimens, and you click on one of those, and you get the metadata, kind of like what Tony was showing from HydroShare, that structure metadata that tells you, gives you the full labels, what kind of links these are. You can click on this and see more information, and you can see the hierarchy of samples, including siblings. In other words, my sample is at 0 to 10 centimeters, or in this case 40 to 50, but there's another similar sample, related sample at 0 to 10. And within this 40 to 50 soil sample interval, we have the children, or all these subsamples that I was talking about. And another example that from the developer of CZ Manager is from the Luquillo, Puerto Rico Critical Zone Observatory. This is Miguel Leon. All credit here for the data goes to him, not me, but it's a great example. They collect all kinds of data for watershed, soil, streams, vegetation, weather. And in this case, you can get an open or public link where you can explore some of this. I collected the screenshots via that public interface, or you can go to their website. You see on the left the same example where you have, except it's a lot richer, lots of different data types collected in this part of Puerto Rico. And I clicked on one of those, the Rio Icaco's tributary, a stream tributary, and here's what they have. This sample below it, I'm looking at the middle screenshot, is all from the HOBO U26 dissolved oxygen probe. So you get this metadata that is right in front of you, so you know how to interpret it. And I clicked on one of the graph data links and got this time series that I can interact with, and it's rich with information about what was done, at what point was the sensor changed, etc., and that a user would be able to download this as well as explore it in basic ways. So again, the investment you put into managing your own metadata and data, you get to benefit from directly by having rich capabilities on top of it. Okay, waiting here. Will ODM2 save us from extinction? Well, not yet. We're working towards it. It does have lots of capabilities, but also rough edges. And it is typical that with greater capabilities and integration come more complexity. And ODM2 is certainly no exception. Hopefully, HydroShare will save us from extinction, especially when it supports ODM2 and other standard systems and formats and more richly. And doing that will lead to what has been FAIR, this heading or umbrella that is being more broadly adopted over the last few years by more and more scientific communities for that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. Definitely, we hope that ODM2 is a gift to the future, especially to your future selves in that the investment you put in today, you can leverage it later, but also to the present and future users. Like I said, we are have built everything on open source software, all the tools and formats, so that there can be broad community access, uptake, and contributions. But in the long run, ODN2 will only be successful if there is greater community adoption and contributions, so that it can sustain itself and not die, I guess. And that's what happens often with different kinds of standards, that uptake varies. Some are robust and will be here forever. Others go up and down. Let's see. I clicked on page down, and I don't remember if this is okay.
Okay. Thank you, Emilio. We're going to move right on to the next presenter, Amber Jones. Participants, if you have questions, now is a great time to start adding them to the. Oopsie daisies. That's not good. Hold on a second. Now is a good time to start adding them to the chat box. Amber, if you're having trouble advancing the slides, just let me know and I'll advance them for you. Amber, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. So to get started, I will see if I can advance the slide.
Here, why don't you just tell me when you want to advance and I'll do it for you.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. So I put in the title slide, and I liked how Emilio talked about metadata being a gift to the future, especially to our future selves. And I am specifically going to be talking about how metadata played a role in a project that I was involved with. And HydroShare specifically helped us not only meet our data management plan, but help us at least save our project, if not quite the world. Go ahead, Tony. So the project, it was called iUtah, and this was an interdisciplinary, it was a multi-institution project. It was an NSF EPSCoR project for Utah, but it had a variety of diverse participants, and we faced data sharing and publication challenges across biophysical, social sciences, and we had this statement in our initial data management plan. All of the primary data sets will be made freely and publicly available. And many projects have statements like that, right? But how do we actually accomplish this? Go ahead. So this is a slide that comes from a paper by Bill Michener that's several years old now, but it's this concept of information entropy. And so on the y-axis, we have the information content of data and metadata, and as time goes by, that value decreases. So it's high at the time of publication, and then details about the data are lost, and then eventually the data may even be lost. And this is typically what we observe. Go ahead, Tony. And these are a few quotes from a few different papers, but they resonate with me and my experience with doing science and working with others in scientific groups. So don't underestimate your ability to forget details about a study. If the information on an observation is lost, it's lost forever because it's impossible to measure in the original context. If the rewards of the data deluge are to be reaped, researchers who produce the data must share them in such a way that they're interpretable and reusable by others. So each one of those is referring to metadata, the information about an observation, the details about a study, making them interpretable and reusable. Go ahead, Tony. So our objective for data management, at least for the iUtah project, was to reverse the process and actually increase the information content of data so that as time goes by, that it can be reused, it can be synthesized, it can be further interpreted. So this was initiated with a project-specific repository, but it had limitations, so we moved all of our data sharing and publication to HydroShare. And that's the first step here, curated data published in a data repository. Go ahead, Tony. So HydroShare, Emilio presented that at first, and it really provided flexibility, support, longevity, the ability for collaboration, and the formal publication of data sets and the issuing of DOIs. And primarily our project used HydroShare in two distinct ways. And so I'll illustrate those here. And Tony, you're gonna love this because I've got animations here. But the first on this slide is investigator data sets, either an individual or a small group of investigators. So first, typically data are collected in the field and then transformed into a shareable format. Go ahead. Then the data set would be deposited in the online HydroShare repository, and this might just be privately at first or shareable with colleagues, then worked with the data manager to verify and curate the data and metadata, that's the role I was in at that point, was as the data manager, so helping these investigators to get their data sets squared away. Then a paper would be submitted for publication. They would respond to reviewers, then the data would be officially published in HydroShare and receive a DOI. Then the next step is that the paper would be published and the HydroShare resource that contained the data would be cited in the reference list for the paper. Okay, go ahead. So the next way that our project was incorporating HydroShare was in automated publication workflow for sensor-based data. So we had all of these environmental sensors collecting data, and we had this workflow illustrated here. The data would stream into databases, which we then developed some utilities that connected to the HydroShare API to automatically update data files that are shared within HydroShare. And now we had to make sure that we had metadata for all of those data that we're streaming in as well. Okay, go ahead. So I like this image of this representation of the scientific process because it's a cycle that includes reproduction. So we need to consider what metadata is needed to make the science reproducible. HydroShare provides a standard set of metadata elements for describing the resources that you create. And the users, we all need to treat data sets and models as first-class research products along with the papers that are written about them. And there's opportunity to maximize the value of those products by practicing good data management and creating descriptive metadata that's more than just the bare bones basic. Okay, go ahead. So for our project, a few things that we did. We had a data policy, we had guidelines that had timeframes for data sharing, we had training, we had tutorials, and we had review and publication and curation, of the submitted data sets. But it wasn't a really straightforward process because it really has required this cultural shift to try and change the paradigm from my data to our data. Okay, go ahead. And through the process, a lot of the lessons that we learned, we generalized in this guide for data authors and publishers, which is specifically geared toward HydroShare users, but the concepts are pretty universal. And the basic premise, I think, about metadata and about data organization and considering how to publish data is to consider whether another researcher can reasonably understand and replicate the work. So a lot of people will do the minimum, but the culture is changing where there are rewards and requirements for quality data management. And we observed this in our project too, right? Like we had carrots and sticks, both to encourage and require that. And a big takeaway is that considering data management from the beginning facilitates the process. If there's a moderator or a curator to review data and metadata, that really improves the content and the reproducibility. If there's no one in that role, or if you're working in an ad hoc sort of situation, even a peer review with a colleague can be really helpful. And then the very specific item that we would be telling people over and over was to use some sort of a README file or a metadata component, which could be like a header in the file, like Tony showed some examples of, but describe the overall organization of the resource and the content, what is included within each file, define the variables, have detailed description of the methods, and those are pretty general concepts that really apply to all cases. And with that, I think that's all I've got.
Thank you so much, Amber. So our next speaker, whoops, is Jezra, and oh my goodness. Jezra, I'm going to give you control right now, and again, if you can't advance the slides, then just let me know. But take it away.
Alrighty. Okay. Let's see. So I'm Jezra. I'm with the Nooksack Indian Tribe up in Bellingham, Washington. And let's see, I'm going to try to advance the slide here. Maybe it's an up or a down.
Try clicking on it.
Oh, yeah. Okay, whoops. Alrighty. Okay, so I just wanted to show you kind of an example of how tribal science is advancing with cyber infrastructure and the gift of metadata. And the Nooksack tribe has been working with collaborators at the University of Washington for the last few years, developing downscaled hydroclimatology models for the Nooksack watershed, ultimately to inform the tribe on climate change impacts to treaty resources such as water quantity, water quality, or and ultimately like salmon populations, how that's affecting salmon populations, which are culturally significant to tribes. All right. Okay, so what we found in developing those models is just these data gaps, this lack of data, especially of air temperature at high elevations. In the Nooksack watershed, it drains Mount Baker, which is a heavily glaciated volcano, as you can see in the map there. And so we set out a few years ago to measure air temperature, ground temperature, and relative humidity at various elevations along a transect to better understand lapse rates of air temperature in mountainous terrain. And many models use like a linear or a constant lapse rate through time, so which we found to be misrepresentative of a glaciated, maritime, and rainy watershed. It ultimately has implications for model outputs such as snow water equivalent, glacier melt, stream flow, stream temperature, and then these are ultimately used as inputs to other models like salmon habitat models or sediment transport models. So, the next slide. Whoops. So, our metadata approach, we knew we wanted to publish this data set because there's many efforts in Western Washington to downscale climate change impacts, especially among tribes. So we figured our data set and lapse rates could be utilized or directly utilized or serve as like a pilot for other projects in other watersheds. And so we have all of our raw files and Jupyter notebooks and output files from that code in HydroShare, which I like to call the Facebook for hydrologists. And I really like HydroShare because it builds the story around the data and just kind of sets the stage. It also, by publishing, your HydroShare resource, you protect your intellectual property, which can be an issue with tribes especially. So our code is archived in GitHub, and also the code, I think we built the code to auto-populate the ODM templates, which, as Emilio said, automatically, or that's used to upload data to the Hydro client, the quasi-Hydro client, where you can then visualize and share your data. So, and I really like HydroShare and Hydro client, or I enjoyed using them because I think tribal data is many times overlooked, and many people don't even know that tribes are even collecting data. So HydroShare and Hydro client, they're kind of, and the metadata therein are kind of a way to advertise these efforts. And so, it just levels the playing field, like I said here, and lets everyone have a seat at the table. So it also has the potential to reduce duplicate data collection efforts. So not only are other agencies collecting similar data within the Nooksack watershed in particular, but many other tribes collect similar data in other watersheds. And I think there's just been this lack of connection between these data sets, which is unfortunate. So, let's see. And I think, you know, as some of you probably know, you know, government agencies like the USGS has a different database than like the EPA database, and, you know, state like our Washington Department of Ecology database is different, and none of them communicate to each other. So I think, you know, HydroClient is a way to kind of get everyone represented equally. So let's see. So ultimately, we published our HydroShare resource and our GitHub repository, which I have the DOI linked here. And then we kind of packaged all of this and submitted an article to the Data in Brief journal, which is a branch of Elsevier. And I think Data in Brief is a great way to just increase traffic to your project, to your data, and the potential to build collaborative networks. And then also protect your, you know, your intellectual property. Whoops. So the lessons that I learned as kind of a novice to this cyber infrastructure approach was that metadata strengthens science in time, and can basically allow data to live indefinitely. So tribes are always thinking of how what we do today will affect 7 generations from now. And I think metadata creates that continuity between generations. It also, and also continuity between agencies and coworkers and collaborators. So metadata, in a sense, can create community. Metadata also strengthens science in space because I think it's necessary to solve these regional and global problems, such as like climate change. So many tribes in the Northwest, they share these usual and accustomed areas. So not necessarily the reservations, but like the areas that they're used to inhabiting since time immemorial. And many tribes are using these downscaled models for their watersheds in order to adapt to climate change. And so I feel like metadata could, you know, really strengthen that network. And I'm going to be attending Waterhackweek, and so I'd like to eventually build that cyber infrastructure necessary to connect these efforts among tribes, share the code, share our challenges, and maybe share some lapse rates. So with that, I'll pass it on to you guys for questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I want to thank all the presenters for these fantastic presentations, or all the panelists for these fantastic presentations. We have a few minutes. We would like to you know, have a discussion around some of these. So we're going to grab a question or two. If we have any, do we have any questions? Emily, do you see if we have any questions from the participants?
I do not see any questions just yet. So again, if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat box.
Oops.
Let's see. While we're kind of waiting for questions to come in, Tony, did you have any questions that you wanted to?
Sure.
Across the group?
Let me see here. I had thought of something ahead of time, so let me see if I can find that. So metadata collection and organization seems tedious and difficult. So as someone that, if an early career scientist or someone that's new to collecting data or encounters himself or finds a data set that maybe is a little bit lacking, what would you guys suggest is the single most important thing that they can do to contribute to the shareability and the collaboration aspects of a data set in terms of metadata? So why don't we just go ahead and start? Is that Emilio?
This is Amber. I wondered if you'd repeat.
Amber, yeah, can you give us your thoughts?
Will you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm so sorry. So as someone that maybe is new to collecting data or finds themselves with a data set that maybe is a little bit lacking, or it doesn't have, maybe the metadata is more in someone's head or jotted down on a piece of paper, what is the single most important thing that you would recommend that an early career scientist does to improve the discoverability of the data set in terms of like adding metadata or putting it online, or what do you think would be the most important thing they could do?
So I don't think that there's one size fits all or any sort of prescriptive instruction. And that's why, like, the document I showed at the end of my slides, where we came away with some takeaways that we encountered after working with researchers from a lot of different fields, was here's some general principles, right? And do what works best for the type of data that's for your field and for the type of users that you maybe anticipate this having. And that's sometimes hard to anticipate, right? But to consider who might be using these data and what sort of format would they want and what information would they want to come with it. And sometimes you might not know who that might be, so consider yourself. And you can use what we might call the golden rule, right? Provide metadata or information with it that you would wish to have yourself.
All right, thanks, Amber. So we're running low on time, so what I'll do is I'll just ask another question to the other two panelists, and maybe you guys can give us some thoughts.
I see it, Tony.
Yes?
There's a question that came in the chat box, which is kind of logistical. But when and where will the slides be shared?
So the slides will be shared very shortly on HydroShare, and the recording of this video will be shared on the CUAHSI website. And we can give you more information about that when they're posted. But it should be in the next couple days. Okay, so let me just ask one more question in regards to the panel. So this is for Emilio and Jezra. What should a scientist do when they come across a data set or they're given something that has very little metadata? What do you do?
I'll start, since someone has to. In that case, first it should encourage you in the future to not put others in that situation and therefore document your data better. So it should inspire you to be better. But when you have that situation, I guess you only have two choices. Either you decide that it's too much work to try to use that data and that you don't have time. So you are frustrated and decide, okay, I'll move on to something that is more usable. Or you follow up to the source of the data. Did you get it as a file or a couple of documents that you found online or someone sent to you? In that case, follow up with the scientist. And in most cases, you'll find that most people, be it from academics or agencies, will try to help. Depending on their time. And they will essentially be asking metadata questions, and they will be giving you metadata answers in a highly non-structured way. So you'll get collections of emails that you'll piece together to complete your metadata. In some cases, you may get documents that they forgot to send you that give you that information you need to use and interpret that data. You may have gotten that data also from a data system, and it may be that in that source of data, in the article where that data was included, that there is a lot more information in the article, in the data system, and so on. So go back to the source, basically, whether it's a person or a system or a paper, and follow up from there.
Thanks, Emilio. Jezra, we have about 1 minute. Do you have any thoughts?
Sure. I guess I've run into this problem a few times, whether, I just didn't think to write down certain details of data collection or my staff didn't. And so sometimes it's possible to go back in the field and like measure that parameter or take extra notes. Sometimes I've had to just throw away data sets or just not use them in a report, or just have the caveat of like, this is qualitative versus, quantitative, or just, just presenting what it is for what it is and not necessarily putting too much into it. So I guess I definitely had this problem before, and it is frustrating. So yes, I agree with Emilio that it should teach you a lesson not to do it again. But maybe like set your field notebook, like make sure you have all the details in advance. If it is a field project, that is, just make sure you write all the things you want to write down in advance. So that might help in the future. So.
Thank you so much. So there's another, some more information about where these, the presentation and the video will be held. Christina Banderagota, who's an organizer of the event, typed in the chat that she will post this on the Cyberseminar Slack channel. So if you want more immediate access to it, go join the Slack group, check out that channel, and I'll give you the link one more time here. But we are almost out of time. I want to give Christina an opportunity to give us a public service announcement.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for everyone for joining, and especially thank you to the panelists for authentically sharing all the things you know about metadata and how we should be kind to each other going forward. This is a public service announcement as part of a effort to bring professional development to this type of software development and data science training and cyber infrastructure advancement. And all you need to know is that a lot of people feel like imposters, and there's people who talk about how we all feel like imposters, and imposter syndrome is something that everyone has a challenge with. And further, like knowing that everyone feels this way is one thing, but then also just building your own skills and your personal resilience to know what to do with yourself when you feel that way is an additional challenge. So we have, you can find more like funny things about being a scientist that I think is easy to consume when you need a break from feeling stressed at errant science, and also just resources for how to be brave at work. This Brave Not Perfect podcast is organized by the founder of Girls Who Code, and spinoff of that is a great podcast that's supportive for all the things that a lot of people struggle with at work. So that is our public service announcement for today.
Thank you, Christina. It's fantastic.
Further, in parallel, we have another cyber seminar going on with a partner network, the Critical Zone Researcher Network, and that's going to start next month. It's going to be in parallel with this cyber seminar series, but it will also be recorded. So,
and yes, and you can find more information about this on the CUAHSI website if you go to the Cyberseminars webpage. So just to wrap up here, next week, same time, same place, we have another seminar. It is focused on community repositories. This will feature some of the things that you may have seen in this talk. Things like HydroShare is a community repository. We'll be talking about or answering the questions: is it realistic to distribute all the data and unify all of the software? And what games are we playing to navigate complex communities and share research? So come join us for a very interesting presentation from another group of panelists and a lively discussion next week. As far as learning activities, to keep on learning, if you want to keep on learning, which we encourage you to do, go to HydroShare and discover a data set. Is the metadata sufficient to describe it? Can you find some awesome data in HydroShare, or can you find some terrible data in HydroShare? I bet you can find both. If you want to go even further, upload your data to HydroShare and add metadata, and you can see how challenging it can be at times, and how things like Emilio talked about, and Jezra uploading, actually all three of the panelists talked about uploading observation data model to databases, extract all this metadata for you. You can also go to the CUAHSI HIS and discover data on the web platform. Now, for next week, if you want to get ahead and learn a little bit about or prepare a little bit for the next seminar, go to explore the Design Safe Data Depot. This is a data repository. Check out what kind of data they have, what kind of metadata they have, what are the similarities between it and HydroShare, what are the features that are nice, and what are the features that are bad, things like that. Another thing to explore is the Community Surface Dynamics Modeling System repository, also known as the CSDMS or systems. What kind of data are they archiving here? You might find some differences in the types of data they're trying to describe than the types that we've described here. And yes, ask questions in Slack. And I want to, throw this out there, that Slack link again. Go give us your name and your email. We'll add you to the channel and join our group of our community of Waterhackweek. And look at all these smiling, happy people. Come join us, be one of them, and if not, just join us on these calls and be part of our community. Did you have one more thing to mention here?
No, these are just our, shout out.
No, this is our project, yeah, and our sponsors. So we are just out of time now, so I want to thank all of the panelists for presenting and fielding some questions, and thank all of you for attending, and we will see you next Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all.
Thank you.